Good Choices, a holistic conversation about dance, art, and life with Sabine Parzer. Hi, everybody. This is Sabine with another episode of Good Choices, a holistic conversation about dance, art, and life. I'm very happy to have Olive Bieringa as my guest today. Olive is a dancer, a performance and visual artist. She works at the intersection of social and creative practice, pedagogy, and healing. Olive has education both in dance and in visual arts. She is a certified body-mind centering therapist. She is the programming director of Somatic Education at the Australasia Institute in Melbourne. She has a long-term collaboration with Otto Ramstad in their project, which is called BodyCartography. She is currently a doctoral candidate at the Theatre Academy at Uniarts in Helsinki in Finland. She is originally from New Zealand, has studied in Holland at the European Dance Developmental Center. She got a Master's of Fine Arts in Performance and New Media at the Long Island University in Brooklyn, New York. She is an Ismeta somatic movement therapist, a shiatsu practitioner, and she has training in danceability. We had a wonderful conversation about many different aspects about dance. We talk about embryology, about body-mind centering, about the interconnection between somatic, visual, and artistic work. We talk about personal lives, personal issues, collaborations, and I'm happy to share that conversation with you. If you like this conversation or if you think it is interesting for somebody else, please share it. Hello everybody, this is Sabine Parzer. I'm very happy to be here with another episode of Good Choices, a holistic conversation of dance, art and life. My guest today is Olive Bieringa. Is that how you pronounce your last name? I'm not even sure.
Yeah,
Olive. Yeah?
I guess if we were in the Netherlands, we would say Bieringa, and I say Bieringa.
Bieringa. Okay. Do you have
Bieringa.
Dutch roots? Is that where your name comes from?
Yeah, my father's family's Netherlands, well, from Friesland, and my mother's family is actually from Germany, so German Jewish ancestry. Yeah.
But you grew up in New Zealand, is that correct?
Yeah, in Aotearoa in New Zealand, and I guess I left in the where are we? In the early 90s to do my dance training in Arnhem in the Netherlands. So,
But your
yeah.
family is from Netherlands, Germany. Did they immigrate during the war, or is that part of the family
Yeah.
sort of migration?
Yeah, so my father's family immigrated post-war, and my mother's
Uh-huh.
family immigrated, left Berlin in 33 when Hitler got voted in as chancellor, and migrated first to London and then to the South Pacific. My mother grew up on a very tiny island called Norfolk Island, which was a colony of Australia, and then they eventually moved to New Zealand, which is where they met and where I was born. So, yeah.
Wow. Well, we're jumping right in here. We were just chatting a little bit before. Olive, you're my first guest here on the podcast, who I've actually not met in person, which seems so odd because I've known about you and I've known about your work for a very long time. We seem to circle in the same festivals or in the same field for sure. I'm sure we have many common friends, and yet we have never met in person. So I'm really honored to have you here. And to be able to speak about your work also. Yeah, it's great.
Thank you. Thank you so
Well,
much for having me.
thank you. Yeah, it's interesting because I navigate through. I mean, I haven't been doing the podcast for that long. I started in the fall, and of course, I start with all my favorite people, which are also happen to be my friends. But I navigate alongside the topics of my work, of course, and it's very interesting because I see you as a dancer, as a performer, as an artist, but you also very clearly define yourself as a somatic practitioner and as a person who works within the field of healing or the healing arts. and that is something that I've been very busy with especially in the last 20 years. I mean, I come from the performing arts. I'm a professional dancer and a choreographer, and then right about the end of the 90s, and I'm sure, or I'm wondering if we have, even if we don't know each other, have a similar timeline. So about 25 years ago, I started getting interested more in the somatic area, into the healing arts, into authentic movement on my end, but also different bodywork practices. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your timeline. Like, where did you start as a dancer, and where was that transition into more of that somatic therapeutic healing sort of it I don't see them as separate fields. That's why I'm hesitating to
Yes.
say field,
Yeah.
but that that step
Yeah.
over onto that other sort of quality of what it is that we're doing here.
I think it was a question that those two things always existed for me on some level, but they were further apart.
Uh-huh.
Like that they were skills that were being learnt simultaneously in different, slightly different. I mean, I can say also, I can really speak to even just my family dynamic, which is that I grew up in a family that, I grew up in Aotearoa, in a country that is super, like, nature is amazing, and there's a kind of certain kind of physicality that's engendered within the landscape in New Zealand and the cultural context of being in the South Pacific. And I think that there was a certain kind of physicality that existed in the dance world. And even when you sort of reflect on New Zealand dancers that maybe now, there's like a certain kind of like value system around kind of big physical movement. And
A
I grew up in a
groundedness,
house,
even a groundedness that
yeah,
we might not even
and
have, yeah, here in the
yes,
in
and a
Europe or in the US. Yeah.
yes, and a relationship to space,
Yeah.
like a really kind of clear capacity to be in space and to use space and to know how to move through space. And then my particular context, my parents were both involved in the visual arts and in a super kind of critical visual art world, right? Which I feel like, as a teenager, I had to kind of find myself, find my like own position in relationship to. And so I was deeply immersed myself in visual art practices growing up. And then there was a point where I was like, I need to understand the body. I need to understand sensuality. I need to understand like the materials of who I am. And I need to be in the kind of vulnerability of the body as a way to kind of step back or step towards something that was more authentic for myself and that was less cognitive and conceptual and critical. Yeah. So I think that was kind of a predetermined pathway, or it was like something that was immediately like a kind of something I needed to seek out for myself in order to find comfort, in order to be able to kind of make a measure of what was important for me, what was the value system I needed. And I think in doing that, I also moved to the other side of the world and created a distance between my family and myself in order to do some of that work. And it was through my excitement, it was sort of this, it was like through my excitement of entering the world of improvisational dance and the world of somatic work that was unfolding within my early education, where I was, learning about contact improvisation. I was learning about body-mind centering. I was working with Deborah Hay and Steve Paxton and all these amazing people as part of my education, that I realized, I think that I started to, create that my personal desire was not only about practicing as a mover, but was also about making dances, and that I wanted to make things. And I had always been in the practice of making things, but now I wanted to make live things that would happen in time and that would unfold and that were coming out of my body, or I was playing with other people's bodies in time and space. And so the dance making piece, you know, really emerged, I would say. I mean, it was there from the time I was also 5 or 6 years old. I was always making dances, but I was also making other things too. And then, but I think the recognition that I could actually do it as a practice and do it for my living, haha. And then, and then I think when I left school, I realized that I had also learned all these body work skills, right? I had learned all this movement education stuff, and that I could actually study that more and also become like a body worker or a movement therapist, and that those were, or a pedagogue, and that those were things that I had learned so much about within my 4-year education, but that they hadn't been named. They hadn't been laid out as career paths, because our focus in school had been so much about the art making, right? And the mystery of the art making. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, if I supplemented those things with a little more study, then I could also cultivate those things as part of my practice.
Yeah. And this is at the European Dance, what was it called in the Netherlands? The 4-year school?
Yeah, it was called CNDO. It was called initially CNDO.
Yeah.
And then it was called EDDC, so the European Dance Development Center, and it became part of the larger Hochschule or art school, art academy.
And that was an amazing time to be studying at that place in Holland, especially, but also in that time period, because as I was talking to many other friends, and I mean, I know that so many amazing artists came out of that period who had studied there. And I know the school split at one point, and so there was there was basically 2 schools happening. But even what you already mentioned was that it wasn't just about technique. I mean, when I went to school in Chicago. I have a bachelor's of arts in modern dance. It was just beginning to sort of recognize that there are more somatic practices that support our dance practice. But I think in Holland it was already present, and you guys were not only learning technique, but you were really learning how to practice, how to, like, not necessarily, as I understand it, please correct me, or please talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's so interesting. In order how to train an artist is such a almost contradictory thing. Yeah, of course, there's on one hand there's a technique that needs to be learned, or there's craft that needs to be learned, but on the other hand, how do you develop humanity, or how do you develop a sense of self, or how do you develop a sense of connection to Earth, which isn't a big deal in terms of relationship to arts. It's just starting to emerge in a way. So I'm wondering if we can just go back a little bit to those 4 years. What was so special about that time? What do you still take with you?
Well, I think it was a super problematic utopia that I still, like many of my peers that I went through that education with, are still incredibly dear to me. And I think I feel us, some of us left that realm behind, but many of us are still trying to kind of cultivate something that we got out of that education in our current lives, wherever we might be, and whether it's in creating a festival or creating performance work or creating another educational model. Like, I feel that I see it happening, and it's constantly referred to. So it was very interesting. It was a moment where there was a lot of funding, and from the Dutch government, which didn't last for a very long amount of time, but this sort of very radical idea in terms of the proposition of the model was definitely an undoing of everything we knew dance education to be. So the way our education was structured was in workshop formats, and so we would work with specific artists for a month or 6 weeks at a time. And these kind of educational modules were focused around composition or somatic awareness, or technical aspects like video work or lighting design aspects. So there were sort of many different things that teachers were bringing in, but they would kind of get inserted within these different categories which is essentially how they built an educational structure. But in a sense, the mornings that we spent together were, we had a 2-hour class in the morning. And I think the whole redefining of what technique was, or what technique could be, I always have this image of, like, so much of our education, we spend it in constructive rest, which, is an Alexander technique, reference to lying on the floor on our back with our feet up and our knees up, our feet on the floor and our knees up, right? Like this process of, like, dancing and moving and doing hands-on and being in all these kind of very getting the blood moving, essentially, and then going down in constructive rest and letting everything drop under. So this very much, for me, it was very much a process of including the unconscious or the less conscious processes of myself, like dropping into these different states and learning how to build bridges between conscious and unconscious process constantly, and learning how to initiate movement from any part of myself, inside or outside, and being able to call on, whether it was Alexander technique or Qigong or BMC that we were doing, or even, movement phrases across the floor, bringing in this sort of physical knowing then into, like, a Cunningham phrase, or into, like, a Trisha Brown phrase, or just into open improvising, right? And also a process for me of doing just hands-on work with each other in so many unnamed ways, without a specific approach or without a specific form or protocol, but really experimenting with what touch does. And whether that would lead into open improvising or contact improvisation practices together, or choreographic kind of foci, it's like there was such a deep education in terms of touch and imagination and playing with states and sort of emergent qualities of movement. So the undefinedness was really helpful in then being able to transition into the making without things being...
Which I think from an educational point of view is a really big bridge to hold, or is a really big span to hold. Like, on the one hand, you have a goal that you need or want your students to come out and having learned something, and at the same time, what you're giving them at the same time is an open space and the ability to listen and to digest and to integrate and to go deeper, also including an inner world, or inviting an inner world or an inner sensation. And that is, it's not something you can grade. It's not something you can, and I'm sure, or I would imagine, that many people came out having taken many different sort of aspects out of it. I mean, how you describe it, I would imagine that's your very particular take on what those 4 years taught you, or what those 4 years offered you. Also coming from your background, from your parents, having had that visual arts background, that's what you, with your sort of appetite, also took away from.
Yes. Yeah, and I think, some people sunk and some people swam also. So there was it was a very kind of bold proposition that wasn't fully supported for some people, right? And for the people that thrived in being up for the improvising and being up for the not knowing and being up for the kind of self-inventing, it was really wonderful. So it was controversial and it was exciting. Yeah.
That's a beautiful point, though, because even after an education, I mean, or especially after an education, when you're out there as a freelance artist, and you and I, we've been in the field for many decades, and I'm asking you this: what do you think it takes on an internal aspect, on a level of self or a level of inner resources, that enables us as artists to not sink, but to keep on floating, or to keep on creating, or to keep on defining ourselves even in these open spaces. What do you think on a psychological or even spiritual level does that take, or what does it take for you?
Mm-hmm. 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 Somehow it relates to my sense making in the world. Like it relates to the way that I put things together in order to pass through the world. And so even when things are hard, or there isn't support for something, or I'm exhausted, the capacity to renegotiate and to not know, and to acknowledge that maybe I'm confused and the thing isn't clear yet. Like the thing just isn't clear, and I'm here and I'm in this thing and it's not clear. And how do I just sit with that? Or how do I allow myself to be in the lack of clarity, or in the struggle, and acknowledge that it's fucking hard, and sit with it. And sometimes, that's fine, and sometimes it's also not fine, and I need to say stop, and I need to make a different choice. But for sure, being able to understand that the struggle is part of the process of making the work, or finding the way to make the work, or to continue the teaching, within this frame of the world of improvisation and somatics. Is a sense making, is my way of kind of making a pathway for myself that has meaning and value.
Yeah, it sounds it sounds like
yeah.
No, go ahead. Well, it sounds
no, I
like
just was thinking.
It sounds like to me what's also, maybe what's something that's so sort of internalized for us is that there is a sense of creativity that's so organic or so natural that when you're speaking about this is how you make sense going through the world, is this by connecting or by making, that it is somewhere very deep instilled in you that you can make, or that you can sort of also create whatever it is, if it's a meal, or if it's a family, or if it's a space, or so. And I'm wondering if that is something that you feel like that has been given to you, like is that something that came from your family also, or is that something that you have to keep on working on rekindling all the time? I mean, it's one of the age-old questions of where does art come from, in a way. Where do you sense that your making comes from?
I think it's in each of us. We inherently self-created ourselves. So I think that it's within our DNA on some level. And at the same time, I also can acknowledge the privilege of my own childhood and my own life, in that, yes, I got to witness other people in creative acts all the time in the process of making, and have in some ways can't see another option. Right? So maybe that's my suffering, that I can only see this way, and that I couldn't just change my life easily. I mean, of course I could change my life, but in some way, there wasn't an option, like I say, there isn't an option for me just to stop doing that, having cultivated that my whole life. So I think, in every small act that, in terms of how we live our life, how we feed ourselves, how we kind of pursue our everyday, things that we need to do, there is improvisation and choice in all of those things, as you know so well. And yet, and what do we consider to be our art making? Right? Is it the meal? Is it how we live? Is it just what we get funding for? right? So all of this sort of question or the possibilities for this sort of joyous unfolding in terms of life and in terms of how we organize kind of and connect out into and bring back into ourself, like even that as an act of this sort of figure eight of what we bring in from the outside world and what we're willing to perceive of the outside world as a creative act, and is something we can cultivate and practice and transform in terms of how we perceive the world and how the world perceives us, and then what's possible inside of that. Does that make sense?
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you. It's beautiful because I think
Yeah.
you're talking about at the core of it in so many ways. We're talking about life, and I think that has been such a big shift in terms of how we view art. Art used to be this thing, and I mean, I worked on stage and off stage for 10, 15 years, and I stepped out of that life because I felt like it was so artificial. It was this ivory tower. I was only in the theater, and I was not in nature. I was not connecting to, I was only, with other dancers. And when we take the step back and reconnect to even ourselves on a cellular level, and this is a perfect segue to actually your project. Is that art has a different meaning, or art is something that is not as dramatically superimposed, highbrow, but it's life. It's a quality of life, and it's a quality of life that we're also privileged to experience within our bodies. So I think you put that beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the segue here would be your project. It's this residency at the Norway's National Medical Museum in Oslo. You're doing this project which is called A Collection of Fluid Spaces. And as I read it on your website, it's a radical embryological laboratory, an installation of dance and somatic states. And I think that sounds fabulous. Would you like to share with us a little bit about that project?
Yeah, sure. It's I'm working or I've been really engaged with embryology for a number of years. I was exposed to embryology being the first 8 to 10 weeks of life, from the time we're conceived until we grow all of our current structures, physical structures, of our bodies while we're in utero. And I was exposed to embryology through the work of Bonnie Bainbridge-Cohen, who is a body-mind centering, the founder of body-mind centering. So I've been exploring this work for a number of years, and when I first met the work, it really was so confounding for me and reorienting for me in many different ways. And it's taken me a long time to find my way in. And for me, making dances and engaging in a kind of constant practice, and in this case, having spent a lot of time also on Zoom with students over the past 2 years, engaging in a practice also of speaking and talking and kind of a poetic languaging of a process, not only being in an embodied kind of space of the studio with people. So I've been really, I guess, sculpting in a way this embryological body or bodies for myself, and have been working with a number of dancers, first in Minneapolis and now in Oslo for the last few years. And we're building a project inside of a medical museum to play really with this idea of what is it to embryologize, or to play with the frozen moments in the museum, to bring in this process of embryologizing ourselves as well as bringing things to life in the museum. And what is it to bring in the kind of messy, fluid, but breathing body into these spaces that are filled with, frozen specimens and dead specimens. And so the project is quite large, and this will be the first iteration of it. It's actually happening in April, and we're bringing in a number of people who are also going to speak and philosophize around what's happening. And we're building a project that relates both to the kind of history of the anatomical theater, but also to kind of reveal some of these practices like hands-on work and body-mind centering, for example, into moving as a kind of like theatrical device. So in a sense, like really pragmatically revealing the materials of the practice. And very excited to have an evolutionary biologist coming to join us, and also somebody who Konrad Obermeier is also going to join us from Munich, who is a osteopath and Rolfing trainer who discovered or rediscovered the work of Bleichschmidt, who is a very amazing embryologist who was working at the turn of the century or early in the 30s and 40s mostly. So, and again, that, brings back the whole Jewish Nazi narrative actually in relationship to also my history, just as a kind of little reconnect. But so this layering really of understanding and of being able to play with and transform our own moving, and on a deeper level our moving as our own behavior, in order to understand something about like this process that for most of us is in the dark or is unconscious, like it's pre-conscious, like it's a process that we all moved through, and yet most of us have no idea, and the information seems so complicated and it seems so like kind of hidden culturally, right? So what would it be to reveal some of this story of embryogenesis, and really in relationship to our own embryonic journey versus somebody else's? Yeah.
So this would be my question for listeners or viewers who might not be so immersed in the field. It's like, I mean, you were almost answering the question, but I'm gonna ask it again. First of all, I have to say embryologizing. Can you say it again?
Embryologizing. It's a
embryologizing.
Yeah.
I love that. So I could be embryologizing my state or my movement.
Yes.
So what would that look like? So could you be specific about that, or how would you lead people into that? And the second part to that question is what do I have? What do I get from that? Like, why is that interesting to me? Or why would I want to spend time investigating a part of my life that I don't remember? And what do I have to gain from that?
So maybe I'll answer the second question first, and then I'll go back to the first question. Oh, no, I'll answer the first question first. Embryologizing. So just to say, embryogenesis is the process of your embryonic development. Embryology, in a way, is the scientific kind of study of that. And embryology is a verb that we I don't know if we invented it, but that we're playing with as a way to kind of say, well, when I look at this specimen in a jar, or when I perceive you, I can perceive you now in your current body structure, or I could, oh, you don't have any, like I could perceive you in an earlier moment of your development, right? And I could, in my own dancing, I could play with that moment where I don't have any arms or legs. And I just had these fingertips, this little limb bud that was like beginning to emerge from the side of my body, from my lateral plate mesoderm. And that little limb bud is not just the fingers that are growing, but it's the whole arm. And that whole arm, right, from the scapula all the way to the fingertips, that whole arm is growing as one unit. And as that whole arm is growing as one unit, it's the fluid spaces in the limb that open up first. So it's not the bones forming, but it's actually the fluid spaces that form and open up first. And as this whole arm develops, it didn't sprout off of the spine, but it grew separately from my spine. And then later it made a connection, which is called the clavicle, right, to my spine. But in the meantime, this little limb bud, it's forming and growing. It's like a little flipper, and it's helping me, right? It's coming literally out of the side of my body, and at a certain point it's also going to come all the way out, and it's going to spiral and rotate as it grows. But this possibility for me to go earlier and to be more simple in my embodiment of myself means that I can rebuild some of the relationships that have maybe been kind of lost through this process of growing up, growing older, getting injured, right? So if, for example, I had a joint injury somewhere in my arm, playing with the wholeness and with this early arm before I had the injury could help my arm re-find its connections on many different levels, right? Fluid, blood, vessel, nerve, fascia, everything, right? So that's one example. But we can do all kinds of amazing things. We can play with our primitive gut tube, right? And what it is to have just a single tube from our mouth down to our anus that hasn't spiraled, that hasn't budded lungs, that hasn't budded a liver and all of these amazing organs that we have. So to find that moment where there's just this single gut tube can be incredibly supportive, right? Mm-hmm. Or to explore the moment where we transitioned from diffusion to circulation and we built a heart. We built our own heart. So all of this process of building is about reorienting and shifting and creating different fluid spaces, because we're just fluid and membrane at this point. So as we do that, we're constantly reorienting ourselves in relationship to space. And so when we begin to play and learn about some of these early patterns that we moved through and we tap into them, maybe our body remembers some of those things, and maybe through that act of remembering, it opens up a different way in which we can perceive ourselves in relationship to the world. Yeah. Or how our parts relate to each other as a whole. Yeah.
I mean, as I'm listening and as I'm watching, my mirror neurons are firing, and I'm sort of moving with you and wanting to join your class and all. I mean, it's juicy. It's really beautiful how embodied that information is with you, but also how clear of a language you have around that, because I think that's the most difficult part. I mean, I know that I work with authentic movement. I work with the unconscious, and there's so many early parts. There's so much, inner child work that's being done, or shadow work that's being done. Everything that's sort of non-tangible, fluid in time. Like we can be 2 and 70 at the same time, and at the same time we can also in authentic movement enter prenatal states, or enter phases of our own birth, or all of that is sort of, there's so much information that's being stored in the body. So when I'm hearing you talk about that very specific part in that development, I also have a very clear image of us being just so animal body, that exactly that development is so inherently located in all of our DNA, and it's then we develop into a human being. But I mean, so many of these stages are so parallel to so many mammals, and again, by doing this work, we're not just reconnecting to different parts of ourselves or different parts of our ancestry or different parts of our DNA, but we're reconnecting to life, and we're reconnecting to other species, and we're reconnecting to Earth. So
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, beautiful. And I think, I think this whole process of the first 4 weeks, I think we're phylotypic. It's called the phylotypic stage. Is this moment where there's like in this moment we could become anything. We could have become fish. We could have become lizard. We could have become monkey. We could have become anything, right? I mean, obviously our DNA and the environment of our mother are both going to determine that we're going to become human, but just that we are no different in that moment in terms of what we've developed and built, right? And I think also the magic of tapping into the early totipotency when we are many, we're never really one. We're sort of one, but we're already two inside of the one, and then we're four when we're just a cluster of cells, and that those cells haven't yet even begun to differentiate. They're all identical, and they could become one of 200 different kind of cell types in the body. I mean, that's just extraordinary. So to be able to kind of access and play with that, I think is very, very powerful. And I think that to answer your second question, right, this process of tapping into that early experience, as well as, which is the other project that I'm working on called Resisting Extinction, which is looking at dying and decomposing, to also tap into the process of dying and decomposing. Again, it's like culturally so in the shadow for many of us. There's something about I think waking up our perception of these two moments that could really support our current living on the planet, our current being in this moment, and being able to hold both the forming, but also even in the process of embryology, cells have to die in order for other cells to differentiate, or in order for forms to be created, like the cells between our fingers, for example, right? So this holding of death and this sort of capacity to grieve the losing feels like an essential piece of life, and I know many people I'm not saying that for the first time, but I think that what I'm trying to figure out with my current research with these two projects is what would it do to kind of wake up the consciousness, at least within the cultural context that I operate within, to enliven and bring these two aspects of our lives more into the light. Yeah.
Oh, it's beautiful. I think what you're talking about is ecosomatics, that connection of the inner body to our living environment. I don't know if you would call it ecosomatics, but it's something that I'm also exploring it through different channels, but I think it's a way of being politically active without going within our work. And one of the biggest questions that I'm asking myself, I'm teaching a lot of people who come from very different backgrounds, who can be professional dancers, but not only. People come because they have a love for dancing, or they're really on a search for more consciousness within their bodies, health-wise, but relationship-wise, but also in terms of healing in this world. And so my question is always, when we dive so deep and we lay on the floor and we kind of busy with ourselves and busy with creating what seems to be just for ourselves, how can we communicate even more clearly that this work is so important in terms of creating consciousness, that we are part of Earth, that we're not inhabiting or we're not superimposing ourselves to other species, but that this really in-depth work is something that hopefully should be healing, or should be supporting an environmentalism or a political action. So you know, that sort of funky place of where are we so busy with ourselves, lying on the floor, being beautiful and creating art and feeling healthy and well, and where's that transition into, okay, where do we get uncomfortable and where do we have to step up a little bit more and speak out and get out of the studio and speak to other people about our work, even if it
Yes.
doesn't, if it's so hard to grasp. And I'm wondering if the work that you're doing in the museum is one step of it also, or if that is something
Mm-hmm.
that you are
Mm-hmm.
intentional
Mm-hmm.
about, or what is
Mm-hmm.
it that
Mm-hmm.
do you think that
Well,
we as
yeah.
artists need to do in order to make that
Yeah.
even clearer?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think for me, that's why I would merge the the pedagogical and the healing and the art making definitions,
Yeah.
because I just want that shit to slide. Like I really, really don't. I mean, and I say that genuinely. Like I want to access other kinds of, like I want, if I'm to teach a workshop, only certain people are going to come to that workshop. And those certain people are wonderful. But if I make a performance, certain other people are going to come towards the work. And they're not necessarily the same people, especially if what I make, I put it outside on the street corner, or then I put the same thing inside a theater, or then I put it inside a museum, an art museum, and then I put it inside a medical museum, right? So every context in which I work, I'm going to expose different publics to how I think, right? And so, or how we collectively, because I'm always working collaboratively with other people. So the sort of emergent processes that we're engaged with are building a collective intelligence, right? That will be completely affected and affecting the environment in which they unfold, right? So yes, I've been creating performance work that in many ways have the same content in them that my classes do. But I say this is a work of art. And of course I'm shifting, of course I'm doing things differently, but I create a lot of one-on-one performances which are in effect leading people on a kind of somatic or experiential journey, right? And even the practice of the dying and decomposing, I've been leading somatizations, but with the public, out in the public space, like in the forest or on a beach or something, right? So it is very much like a workshop that we're in, but I'm calling it art because it frames people's expectations in a different way. Yeah. So I'm very interested in how we can kind of think about what's important for us and who we want to be in the room, because I do think practicing is practicing, and it isn't just about self-bettering, it's practicing in relationship to the world. So if we feel like what we're doing is just cultivating our own self, we need to also think about who we're impacting throughout our day and what we do the moment we walk out of the studio, and how does that practice that I did in the studio have a kind of what is the ethical kind of what does it cultivate in me, and how does it transform the way I relate to the world, right? Because nothing is separate. So it's literally about allowing that thing to have a kind of a full life and an integrity, like what I'm practicing is going to impact the world around me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like how you put it, that you create different settings so different people can come in from a different angle, because it's a fact. People will come and take a workshop who have a certain amount of I don't know, inner freedom or a certain access to moving themselves or wanting to further their own sort of physicality. And then other people will come to an art event, and other people will come to a lecture, when you're or a museum. So I think it's a beautiful way of recognizing how can you be impactful and still staying true to what it is that you're actually communicating.
Yeah.
You said that already, but it's also very apparent in your biography that you love to collaborate. You have a partner, Otto Ramstad, who you have created the BodyCartography Project which I think you started first by yourself, and then Otto later joined you. But you guys have been creating together for how many years?
I guess this is our 25th year. I guess I should celebrate after the podcast.
Mm.
We've been creating work together for 25 years, and body cartography was initially, there were four of us involved very early on. I think I came up with the name, and there were three collaborators I was working with at that time: Tom Seppi, Tracy Vogel, and Samantha Beers, who were all very interested in kind of building collective actions together. And this was before there were flash mobs, and before, I don't know, I mean, in a way, I was interested in the practices that I had, in a way, what I had learned in the world of improvisational dance, but I was interested in bringing the work out into public spaces. And these people were all people in San Francisco who were very invested in community in different ways, and were also all movers. And so we started this thing together, and then it became very clear quite quickly who was sort of invested long-term in art making. And Otto happened to be engaged in very similar practices in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities at the time. And then somehow we met in the context of a diverse dance, integrated dance event that Karen Nelson used to facilitate every year. And it was clear that aesthetically we were both super aligned, and that our interests were really kind of like just weaving in and out of each other constantly. And so, yeah, here we are 25 years later, and we're still doing the same thing. Yeah.
This might be a personal question, but you guys are a couple also. You have a family together. How, and I asked that just really, I asked that other people also, how does that work? How does that work, creating and creating art together and living a daily life, especially also with a kid? Like, how do you manage this? Do the skills, the tools of improvisation help you, or do they get in the way, or how do you manage?
Great questions. I mean, mostly I think they help. I think they really inform a kind of cultivating of space and community. And when one person is feeling like this, the other person can kind of pick up the weight and move forward, or can come back and say, hey, no, don't give up. Don't. Or has clarity, right? So that I think the constant, and that's why I say I work in collaboration. I really don't work, I work on my own some, but it's really for me about constant feedback from different sources that allows me to have clarity around my own kind of goal, right? Or my own agenda, what I think is important. I also think I'm really bossy, and I think Otto is very critical, and I think we both work too hard, and I think we have a daughter who is amazing, who's incredibly adaptable and is incredibly generous with us both. And I also think both of us come from artistic families, and are relatively privileged in that we both have, families who were supportive of us making art. And we also both live far away from where our families are. So also just this logistical reality of traveling and managing life, and now living in a country where we don't speak the language. It's like wonderful, and it's also really exhausting. And I think the past couple of years have been exhausting for everybody. So it's also not easy. I think one of the things that is challenging is here we are after 25 years, and still some of the same issues are the same issues that and that, if you want support, it can be also challenging to find people, therapists, for example, because there's so many things that are so deeply entangled within our relationship that they can't even begin to get their head around some of those things. So, yeah, I think it's quite a lot of work, but it's
I guess
also
it
like
would
we
have to
wouldn't be
be
here.
it would have to be a therapist who is a somatic practitioner, an artist, and has a couples therapy education. Like, because
There
I
you
do
go.
feel like it's so specific. Also, when you include the embryology
Yeah.
in a relationship, I mean, there's a huge amount of vulnerability and a huge amount of open space that opens up, and a huge amount of process work that each of us sort of enter. And I think that makes for some of the complexity in relationships. I mean, it's always complex, but when we are opening up our somatic and our psychosomatic fields, it's not just one person and the other person, or maybe a third person if there is a child. It's like, yeah, and how to dance with that sort of all-encompassing awareness is uh, to the best of in the best moments, I would imagine, super rich. I mean, from the relationships that I've lived with, who I engaged with other people who were practicing this, it can be super rich, super inspiring, super sort of creating a very, very deep level of connection, but also super challenging. Yeah. I love that you say you're bossy and that he's critical. I think that's lovely that you summarize that up. I'm sure there's a resource within that also. Is there a resourced version of bossy and critical?
I think
Like,
it gets the work done, right? It allows. It's like the work gets done and sometimes done well, right? So,
yeah,
I mean, what's so, I think, amazing is when you share with someone, you share a kind of aesthetic value system where you don't have to communicate about certain things, or one person just has to say, it's this, the problem is the clavicle, or the way this thing is not rotating, or that you have this shared language, right, through the body mind centering work, because Otto's also a teacher and practitioner, right? But also, we've worked deeply together with Lisa Nelson and Steve Paxton, and these sort of layers of kind of references, dance references, dance history references, somatic references, anatomical, physiological references, that you can, aesthetically make decisions around things based on how they feel, but be able to communicate it through this shared somatic language somehow. And I think, maybe everybody does that, but not specifically with that vocabulary or something. But this process of
yeah.
So
Malcolm Manning. He's a dear friend, and we've been collaborating over the years, and I mean, on a different level, we're just co-teaching at different times, and he's here in Vienna also now, and he always says we're on the same map. So it's not a question of what landscape we're on. It's just the question of, okay, are we going to turn left or right? Are we going to go down or up? Or are we going to dig deeper? Or are we going to float above? So it's just about like which turn you take, but it's not, the question is not which map we're on, or which country we're in, or which language we're speaking.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Beautiful. I took Malcolm to his first dance class.
Oh, you did? No way.
Yeah. You can ask him about it. Yeah.
I will ask him. Yeah. He will be on the podcast soon. He's a dear friend, and I'm happy to make that connection here also.
Yeah.
Well, Olive, it's been great to talk to you. So many things. I'm sure we could talk more. Hope to meet you in person. Hope to dance with you soon.
That would be lovely. Thank you so much for that
Thank you.
rich conversation.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you for tying in so many
Yeah.
things in your work and having such a large perspective on life and of its connection to art. I really, really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye. See you soon. If you would like to know more about holistic dance and the Holistic Dance Institute, please visit us at our website www.holistic-dance.at. Holistic dance is an invitation to transformation through dance, movement, and touch. It was founded by me, Sabine Parzer, in 2010. It is a mix of different methods, a dynamic cross-method approach from dance pedagogical, dance and body therapeutic, systemic and holistic methods. We offer authentic movement, integrative contact improvisation, somatics and applied anatomy, improvisation, ecosomatics, and many more elements. I offer holistic dance workshops, I offer single sessions, I offer teachers trainings, embodiment trainings, advanced teachers tracks, year groups, and retreats. I would be very happy to see you at one of our events. And if you have any questions, please write me an email.